All right, everybody, welcome back to Contemporary American Literature. This week we will be looking at multiculturalism as a period in the literature of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. In many ways, this follows directly from our discussion last week of what I called the liberation literature of the social movements of the 1960s. It also follows very much from postmodernism and some of the ideas about culture and about the distrust of grand narratives and the potential emergence of new narratives that postmodernism raises. And so this week we will be discussing the rise of the idea of multiculturalism. And we're also moving on a bit in time. So most of the writing we read last week was from the 60s and 70s. This week, I think most of it is from the 80s. And then I think we're going to continue the 80s trend, 80s and 90s trend for the next couple weeks, and then we will find ourselves in the 21st century at the end of the course. So we are moving on in time, and multiculturalism, I think, was a characteristic, a movement of the starting in the late 70s and then really coming to fruition in the 80s and 90s, and then continuing in its influences and effects to this day. So very much like postmodernism, which I mentioned, we did a week or two on postmodernism, but I said we're going to talk about it for the entire rest of the semester. Similarly, multiculturalism will be an idea or a set of ideas, or in some ways a set of problems, a set of questions that, like postmodernism, will engage us for the rest of the semester. So we are talking about it this week, but that doesn't mean we're not going to continue to talk about it in subsequent weeks. So that's that. So multiculturalism as a topic, as an idea, and as a period, as a set of ideas that defines a moment in late 20th century American literature will be our topic. And my illustration, I'm not going to spend very long on visual arts today, though sometimes I do, but my illustration is a painting or a detail of a painting by Jean-Michel Basquiat, the Haitian-American New York painter of the 1980s, who was one of the major visual artists of that time, of the same time period that we're going to be reading works from this week. And I think his imagery often really condenses and crystallizes postmodernism and multiculturalism in very nice visual images. So you can see the combination of high and low. This is a religious image, a sort of classic image for a Western painting to be of an angel, and yet it's also done in the style of graffiti art. So that's a mix of what had been considered a high art, paintings of angels, and low street level art, graffiti art. It has kind of a cultural inflection, a multicultural inflection, in that graffiti art was particularly associated with the multicultural and multiracial working classes of major urban centers like New York City. And so you have this kind of revision, this re-signification of this Christian icon in terms of that multicultural, multiracial working class population. And you have the combination of the secular and the sacred, particularly in the way that the angel, this spiritual figure, is depicted with organs, including sexual organs. And so that revision, that refusal of a certain idealism that had obtained in high culture is, I think, a feature of multiculturalism, as we'll see. So that'll all make more sense once I explain what I think some of the features of multiculturalism are, but I think this is a good visual crystallization of multiculturalism in a piece of visual art. So let's think about some of the historical background to multiculturalism as a period. I say 1970 to 2000. I think it's the 80s and the 90s, and continuing in certain ways, though in other ways we've sort of changed the way we've talked about some of these issues. So, but that's roughly where I'd put the period of multiculturalism in American literature. So what is multiculturalism? Where does it come from? Well, as we saw last week, there were the social movements of the 1960s. There was the women's liberation movement, the gay liberation movement, the civil rights movement giving way to Black power in the African American community, and other challenges to the status quo, to hegemony, from the anti-war movement to movements that at the time were called Chicano rights movements, Native American movements. The American Indian movement comes out at this time, which is kind of a corollary in the Native American community to the Black Power movement. Similarly, you have a nascent Asian American consciousness. So all of this is happening in the late 1960s, and this particularly puts pressure on universities because university campuses tended to be the centers of protest in a lot of places. Remember where we started the class with the GI Bill leading to an expansion, a vast expansion of the university population. So going to a university had been reserved very much for an elite. 100 years ago. It wasn't something that was as available to the general populace as it became after World War II. And then starting in the 60s with the baby boom generation, this large generation, coming of age, you find campuses as the center of this activity, and activism becomes particularly sorry, I'm misspeaking. Activists particularly sort of leverage their activity against university administrations, partially on the theory that if you change what people are taught, that's a way to change the culture. So remember what we talked about between the distinction between the old left and the new left, back when we were talking about postmodernism at the beginning, that the old left, the Marxist left, thought that you had to change economic and political structures really first. I mean, I'm overgeneralizing, but basically that's the idea. That's what's called materialism, that you have to change people's material conditions before they'll change their behavior. So if you're a revolutionary, if you have a theory of revolution, that was the old left idea. You had to change the economic structure of society before you could change the way people thought. The new left emphasized, on the contrary, changing people's thoughts, changing people's language first, that really what you enact materially is a reflection of your perception of the world, which is made up of the ideas you have and the languages you speak, in the broad sense of language, not your actual language you speak necessarily, but the kind of ways you articulate things to yourself. So that's the new left. So I think this new left priority is reflected in the activism on campuses that leads to changes in curriculum. So you have activists on campus saying, we don't just want to study in our humanities and social sciences in particular, we don't just want to study the history of white men, the history of political leaders, the history of what happens at the level of the top of society. We want to study social history. We want to study the history of oppressed and marginalized groups. We want to study the literature and the art of marginalized groups. And so this leads to the formation of departments in universities, or kind of areas of disciplinary concentration in universities, like women's studies, Black studies or Africana studies, Native American studies, Asian American studies. And this in turn drives curricular changes to the canon, even in the older departments like English and history and art history and sociology and well, I almost said philosophy, but I'm not actually sure that one's true. But it drives changes to the curriculum, to the canon. And so what is the canon? The canon is the idea of what you should know, the books you should study. It's kind of a religious term originally. The canon is, what books go in the Bible, but then there's a secular use of the term, which is in your society, what is it that you need to know? What book should you have read? And so there's a change, not all at once and not everywhere, but there's an idea that the canon should be opened up or just abolished, and you shouldn't even have an idea of greatness, which might, from the point of view of some of these activists, just be a male, phallocentric, or white, Western, or capitalist competitive idea that we could do without. And so study in the university should be based on what will produce progressive social change, and not on some idea of what past generations that were full of all sorts of self-interested prejudices thought were great. So these curricular and demographic changes on campus, because also there's demographic changes. There's more and more women in particular entering colleges and universities. There was an imbalance in favor of men for most of the 20th century. Until the end of the 20th century, you get a kind of greater equalization until leading to now, and where it's about 60-40 female to male on college campuses. So there's been this demographic shift, and there's a demographic shift in terms of a diversification in terms of race and ethnicity on campuses as well. So this does not go unchallenged. So this leads to the canon wars or the culture wars of the 1980s. So the 1980s is, at the political level, a very conservative decade. You have the election and re-election of Ronald Reagan, and then the election of his vice president, George H.W. Bush, in 1988. So you have this unbroken conservative streak at the top level of the government, and these were particularly 1984 landslide elections. So you have a kind of conservative movement, I think, even in the general population, that's reacting against some of the developments that we saw in the 60s and 70s. And you also have a conflict on university campuses and in intellectual life between people who were sort of old guard upholders of the way it had been done, to fighting against these challengers. And I think one of the major books of this period was Alan Bloom's neoconservative manifesto, The Closing of the American Mind, of 1987. And you also have this term culture war being introduced, particularly in Patrick Buchanan's speech at the 1992 Republican Convention, this term culture war between advocates of this progressive social change and advocates of, well, I mean, on one hand, the status quo, but also some of the concerns that the conservative side had was, how much sort of challenge can a culture take before it ceases to be a culture? This was Bloom's concern. If you read The Closing of the American Mind, which makes an argument that essentially the idea of the American nation that had sustained all sorts of institutions was being undone. And the challengers would say, well, yes, it is being undone, but that's because it didn't work for everybody. It was oppressive to many people, and this is something that needs to happen. And the word neoconservative, by the way, indicates that the right is not simply, inertly what it was before. The right has also changed demographically. So Bloom is a good example. He was a Jewish American who enters the University of Chicago, which when he enters it in the early, the 40s or early 50s, was one of the only schools that was one of the only kind of elite universities that didn't have discriminatory practices against Jewish Americans. So he is himself an example of some of that opening up of literature and culture that we saw in the mid-20th century with the opening up of the literary realm to African Americans and Jewish Americans and Americans who were Catholics, so that there was kind of this early diversification in the mid-20th century. But by the time that generation is entering middle age or entering old age at the end of the 20th century, they're saying, well, we were able to enter the professions and enter culture because they were liberalized, because they were opened up, not because they were overthrown or abolished, which is what they feared the newer radicals were trying to do. So you have neoconservatives who are they had been liberals, but they turned to the right under the force of this radical challenge. And demographically, they were often themselves Jewish or Catholic Americans who were on the liberal side in the mid-20th century. And a lot of the older African American writers of the mid 20th century period looked with a certain skepticism or wariness on the radical movements. Most famously, Ralph Ellison, who was arguably the major African American author of the 1950s, author of Invisible Man. He wasn't, I wouldn't say he was a neoconservative, but he wasn't thrilled with these developments either. So this is the culture war, the canon war that's happening in particularly, I think, in the 1980s and early 90s. There's that. I want to talk now about some of the changes that are happening. So I just really impromptu talked about the changes happening within the political right. I want to talk about the changes happening within the political left that frames this literature. So number one, you have a change in feminism as you move from the 60s to the 80s. So we mentioned that feminism comes in waves. So you have the first wave, which is in the early 20th century, that is centered on women's suffrage. And then after the kind of the nadir of feminism in the post-war period, that is a kind of reassertion after World War II of traditional family values in the 1950s, you have the second wave of feminism in the 60s and 70s. And that's very much focused on changes to culture and certain economic changes, particularly on women entering middle-class professions from which they were still in a lot of ways barred. And just as an example, a lot of the women writers we talked about from the early part of the course, I was saying things like, well, she went to Radcliffe, she went to Vassar. These were women's colleges. And the reason there were women's colleges is because women weren't admitted in the early and mid 20th century necessarily to Harvard or to other elite schools. So there was this, second wave feminism is a response to these exclusions. So it's an opening up of professions, particularly middle-class professions, to women, and it's a change to culture and law. However, there were critiques, even at the time, and then this leads to the third wave of feminism, that the second wave of feminism had certain flaws within it, that it was substantially a middle-class and white movement that reflected the concerns of middle-class white women. And, as evidence might be this focus on things like entering certain professions, the idea that, women couldn't be the CEOs of major companies. And on the one hand, that's true, and that was an exclusion. But if you were more radical, if you were an anti-capitalist radical, you might say there shouldn't be CEOs, there shouldn't be major companies in this way. So isn't this a bourgeois? Isn't this a middle class fixation? And then on the racial thing, the idea is that this idea that women are excluded from things like the labor force was really only true of middle-class women, that working-class women of all races always had to work outside the home, that the separation of the public, the man would work in the public sphere and the woman would superintend the home. That, going back to the 19th century, was a middle-class idea that didn't apply in the working class and almost never applied, for instance, in the United States to black women, to the extent that race was always a proxy for class in the United States, and that if you were racialized as black, you didn't have middle class status not in the 19th century and not for most of the 20th century either. So second wave feminism doesn't take this into account. And second wave feminism was also regarded as essentialist, that there were certain ideas of what a man was and what a woman was. And I think we maybe saw this reflected in Ursula Le Guin's work in She Unnames Them, where the woman Eve is kind of intuitive and communes with nature and is just naturally this way, and Adam is this man who's putting things together because he's logical and rational. And in a way, this is the old stereotype, just valued differently, that men represent reason and women are irrational. This is an old misogynistic stereotype. And Le Guin just takes it and says, sure, it's true, except that reason isn't good. It's a problem that men are rational, because rationalism is something that deadens the world, But third wave feminism comes along and says, well, you can't think in these essentialist terms. that what we really want to do is show that gender is nothing but a social construct. It doesn't really have any reality to it at all. It has not even any biological reality to it, because scientific ideas are also languages, language games, social constructs, says postmodernism. So third wave feminism is incorporating these postmodern insights. Or attitudes or concepts. I'm not saying they're insights necessarily. I'm presenting a very wide range of viewpoints in this slide. I've gone from the left to the right, and so I want to be clear. I'm not endorsing any of these viewpoints. I'm just trying to explain to you what they are. So from the point of view of third wave feminism, second wave feminism sort of just ratifies the idea that there's such things at all as masculinity, as femininity, that are anything other than social constructs or language games, or as they talked about, performance. That gender was just a role you performed in public based on certain social codes. So it was the way you dressed, given the way that dress would be interpreted in your society. But there was no other reality to it. You could perform a different gender. You could perform no gender. So third wave feminism rejects this essentialism, this idea that there's some essential reality to men and women, and it rejects this white middle class bias of second wave feminism. And they also talk about how gender, race, sexuality, class, all of these things go together. You can't talk about them separately. If it matters if you have to talk about everything together. It matters if you're a white middle class woman, if you're a white working class woman, if you're a white straight working class woman, if you're a black lesbian of the middle class. All of these things have to be discussed together. And this is the idea developed in the 80s of intersectionality. That's a word that is developed in kind of activist and academic circles in the 80s and only becomes popularized in the last decade. But this is the idea that all of these vectors and axes of identity that position you in relation to the power structure of your society have to be taken into account of at once. You can't just say, I'm a woman, and so this means that. It's what else are you? How else does class, sexuality, race play into it? And this also develops the idea of identity politics, which was a phrase coined by the Combahee River Collective, who were a group of black lesbian academics and activists who said that one of the problems of prior forms of activism is that they weren't rooted in identity, and you had to root your desire to change the world and the actions you took to change the world in your identity. You couldn't work to end someone else's oppression. So they said, as black gay women, we are not working to end the oppression of white women. We're working for ourselves. But they also said, because in their view, black women were the most oppressed group in American society, if they ended their own oppression, that would sort of destroy the entire system from the bottom up. So it's still a revolutionary kind of universalist theory in the end, not unlike Marxism. Excuse me, but it says that you have to start from identity, and then in identity itself is intersectional. It's the intersections of all the ways that your relation to your society's power structures operate that defines who you are and limits or enables your ability to change the way things are. And just to go along with that, sort of skip the point in the middle, you have the AIDS epidemic in the 1980s, which primarily affects the gay community. And this brings queer issues to a new prominence and spurs an even more concerted movement for gay rights that eventually comes to fruition in the broader society, I think, in the early 2000s. So these are all the things happening in the background. Now, this political ferment, this ferment happening on campuses also affects publishing. So publishing is how we get the books we read. So publishing is a separate industry from academia, and it's a separate, it's separate from big capital P politics of what goes on in Washington, but it's affected by these things. So mainstream U.S. publishing, starting I think in the late 60s, early 70s, becomes more open to diversity. And particularly we had seen that there was a diversification that I already mentioned that we saw at the beginning of the class, where you have writers like Baldwin and Roth and O'Connor coming to prominence when African American writers or Jewish American writers or Catholic writers had been not completely shut out by any means, but, weren't prominent in the prior period. So you have this initial diversification in the post-war moment, but it expands still further in the 70s, 80s, 90s, particularly with respect to gender. I think there's a greater desire to see female writers of mainstream fiction, and also writers of color, particularly groups that had not sort of accessed that earlier expansion. So you have a kind of renaissance of African American women's writing in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, and then alongside that you have Native American, Asian American, Latin American writing as well. So particularly women of color become major figures in American literature from the 1970s on, such as writers we're going to read this week and in subsequent weeks, and a couple of writers that are not on the syllabus, but that you might find represented in the anthology. So Leslie Marmon Silko, Alice Walker, Louise Erdrich, Toni Morrison, Maxine Hong Kingston, Amy Tan, Sandra Cisneros, Jhumpa Lahiri, and more. And most of the writers on that list we will be reading either this week or in subsequent weeks. And we could maybe sort of use Toni Morrison to sort of symbolize this whole movement because of her rise to the bestseller list. She's a popular writer, but also her incredible success in the, in terms of literary criticism, in terms of being academically canonized, and culminating in her win of the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1993. And we will be reading a work by Morrison this week, and I'll talk more about her biography. So these are the characteristics of multiculturalism as a period in American culture and American life and American literature. So now I want to talk about some of the themes that you see in multicultural literature, some of the themes that you see in the writing of particularly writers of color in the 1970s through the end of the 20th century. I think there's 4 themes that arise again and again, and we've already started to see some of these already. So number 1 is what I've called the interrogation of history, and that is something that Adrienne Rich was writing about in Diving into the Wreck. The idea that history not we, because we weren't there, but as one had learned it in the middle of the 20th century or in the earlier 20th century, was this grand narrative of the progress of liberty in the United States carried out by great men like the founding fathers, like Andrew Jackson, who expands the franchise in the 1820s. No mention of his role in the oppression of Native Americans, for instance, or Thomas Jefferson, who focused very much on liberty during the time in which the Constitution was written, not so much mention of his role in slavery. So you get this triumphal and progressive grand narrative of the march of American freedom told through the lives of these great white men. But what does that leave out? What is not being told? What needs to be revisited? What has been excluded? What groups have been oppressed, and what agency did they exercise in response to that oppression? What, in Rich's words, was the damage done, and what are the treasures that prevail? So let's reopen the books on history. And a lot of the fiction of this period we're not really going to see this so much in this course because we're focusing on short stories, but if we were reading novels, a lot of the novels of this period are historical novels. Toni Morrison's Beloved of 1987, a novel focused on American slavery, is perhaps the preeminent example and perhaps also the major novel of the period. And it is this interrogation of history, this diving into the wreck. So there's that. A second trait, a second theme you will see is an examination of gender, particularly with a focus on women's experiences of male violence or of oppression by men. And you see this in the works of Alice Walker and Maxine Hong Kingston and Leslie Marmon Silko, like in the short story we're going to read, which is about a marriage that's kind of a fraught marriage. So you see this, and this was not uncontroversial within some of the communities of color around these writers. And we saw that with Ishmael Reed. We talked about how Ishmael Reed, who is in many ways a multicultural writer in his attitudes and his emphases, especially with regard to the next trait we're going to talk about, the critique of culture considered white or European, but he had certain qualms, he had certain criticisms of the way that feminism or variants of feminism, such as Alice Walker's womanism, which she named to distinguish it from feminism, which she considered excessively white and middle class. He had some qualms about this as a wedge issue that would divide oppressed or marginalized communities. And Alice Walker's work was criticized in those terms. Maxine Hong Kingston's work was criticized in those terms. And so that became a controversy within Asian American and Native American and African American literature. And Morrison is an interesting figure here because she sort of kept her distance in certain ways from certain articulations of feminism, as if she was also worried in some of the same ways that Reed was, even as she wrote, compelling and complex Black female characters. So that's going to be a complex issue we're going to look at over the course of the semester. The critique of culture considered white or European. I think we've seen that in Reed. We've seen that in Rich. This idea that you can't take for granted, and really this goes back to postmodernism, that you can't take any grand narrative for granted at all. So you can't take the narratives of European civilization or of the white dominant culture for granted. You can't just accept them. But also sometimes you have, depending on the writer, in the multicultural moment, you have an articulation of rival values, of a different, we might say a different grand narrative, a rival grand narrative. And we see that in Reed's Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto, though, he does it in a kind of slightly tongue-in-cheek way. So it's still kind of postmodern. How seriously are we to take this? And I think we see it much more earnestly in Anzaldua's work, which we're going to look at in this lecture. Anzaldua's articulation of the consciousness of the mestiza, which offers a rival version of culture that is arguably incorporates a lot of the insights of postmodernism as it critiques the white dominant North American inheritance. And then the last trait, and I think this particularly comes out in the fiction, is a concern for family, this idea of family as culture, family and culture. If you're articulating a cultural identity that has been marginalized, well, the way culture is transmitted is through the family. And so often multicultural literature is an examination of family and a kind of ambivalent exploration of it. Because on the one hand, you want to show the ways in which your culture has been marginalized. And yet, if you are also incorporating things like feminism or queer liberationism, the family can often be its own kind of oppressive vector. The family can, reproduces itself as a kind of heterosexual norm. And so you might want to critique that. And I think we see that in the works we're going to read this week in Silko's story, Lullaby, and in Amy Tan's story, Two Kinds, which focuses on family. So this and Morrison's work similarly, though not so much the story we're going to read. So I think that's a little different from what we were seeing in the mid-20th century, where we talked about that outsider figure. And one of the institutions that outsider figure was the family. And we see that in, I mean, perhaps most obviously in O'Connor's A Good Man is Hard to Find, whose anti-hero literally kills every member of a family in the name of this kind of existential position. But we see there's totally an escape from family in the Beats. There's no desire to be a part of family in Ginsberg. There's a fairly dystopian portrait of the family in Tennessee Williams. Here we have something much more ambivalent, and it's because it's the family as culture and the family as the way that a marginalized or oppressed group reproduces itself, and yet within that there's all these other gender dynamics and sexual dynamics. And Sonny's Blues, I think, was really a forerunner of the way that family will be looked at in these multicultural texts, as this ambivalent haven from oppression, where there's a lot of conflicts within it, but you can't just get rid of it. You can't just run away from it. So these are the themes of multicultural literature. My picture, by the way, is three authors of this period. So we have Maxine Hong Kingston on the left, Toni Morrison in the center, and Leslie Marmon Silko on the right. And we will be reading, I've mentioned her a couple times, Maxine Hong Kingston in this course, but not this week. I've placed her in a later unit where I want to talk about her in relation to transformations of nonfiction in the late 20th century, because she wrote, that's the whole thing. What is her work? Is it fiction or is it nonfiction? So we will read Maxine Hong Kingston in a couple weeks. So that's that. Now I want to move on to Gloria Anzaldúa, because I think her piece of nonfiction that's in the book, the La Conciencia de la Mestiza, is a great example and an articulation of the values that we were just discussing. And it's also a similar work to the Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto of Ishmael Reed. It's kind of in the same genre of this kind of hybrid, poetic, autobiographical, but also manifesto-like document that articulates a cultural vision. So I want to look at some excerpts from the La Conciencia de la Mestiza. So who is Gloria Anzaldúa? Well, she lived from 1942 to 2004. She was born in Rio Grande Valley, Texas, of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. So she was born and raised right on the border. And I think her family had, at different times, because the border of Texas and Mexico shifted, had been Mexican and then had been American. And she is of mixed Spanish and indigenous ancestry. She earned a BA in English Art and Secondary Education from the University of Texas Pan American, and then a master's in English and Education from UT Austin. And she taught preschool and special education and had this educational career, and then moved to California, where she concentrated on her writing and on teaching, I think, at the college level, and on activism. And she had almost completed a doctoral degree at the time of her death in 2004. And so she was known for co-editing with Sherry Moraga a volume called This Bridge Called My Back, Writings by Radical Women of Color, which is one of the kind of landmark texts of this period, particularly this idea of the writing of and the consciousness of women of color was an important part of multiculturalism, as we've already discussed, because there was this view or this stereotype about the movements of the 60s, which was that the women's movement was very white and the civil rights and Black Power movements were very male. As well as movements like the American Indian movement and related Chicano liberation movements. That these, so we've already talked about the bias of the whiteness of second wave feminism, and then similarly you have this question of the maleness of the particularly separatist or nationalist movements for racial justice, and that women of color didn't have sufficient representation within any of these movements. So they needed to organize together to articulate their specific interests as women of color, which were not reducible to the interests of men of color or of white women. So Anzaldúa co-edits this landmark volume, this bridge called My Back. And then she also writes her famous book, Borderlands La Frontera of 1987, which is a hybrid work from which La Conciencia de la Mestiza, which we're reading this week, is an excerpt. So I usually give a little selection from the Norton Anthology's biography of our authors. And so I wanted to point out this selection on the biography of Anzaldúa. At the core of Anzaldúa's work is the belief that because metaphors structure the way we think, the metaphorical influences of these types of women, so she's trying to revise certain archetypes of women that particularly that are prominent in Mexican culture in order to provide a more sort of progressive view of women, these metaphors must be reshaped so that Chicanas can escape the binary constraint of being judged as either a virgin or a whore and nothing else. Now, what interests me here, again, is this very postmodern idea that the way society is because of the language it uses, the metaphors it uses, the culture it has, the art it produces and consumes. And this is what the radical, the activist, the person who wants to change culture turns her attention to. So again, that new left idea, which arguably by the end of the 20th century and 21st century is just the left idea now, that you change language, you change culture, and that is what will change our society. And you'll note that this gives a great power authority to the writer, to the artist, to the philosopher. Before, in the old left movements, these figures didn't have that much authority. They didn't have that much power. They were seen as subordinate to political parties and other kinds of organizations that would directly intervene in politics in the interests of oppressed classes. Now the idea is more that the intervention is made at the level of art and culture. And it's not so much there's a political party. There was no, there were, when the Marxist idea was that the industrial working class was the most oppressed force in society and the force that needed to change it, they formed labor unions and working class political parties. Anzaldúa and Moraga and related writers don't form a radical woman of color political party. They form a kind of collective of writers and thinkers who make their interventions at the level of education. So that's why it's, you have a concerted attempt to change curriculum and at the level of art and of writing and of literature. And it's a very ambitious mission for the writer now. The writer is the author of a new society. The writer is the person who changes society, who changes the way we think and thus the way we live. So I just want to point that out, and that is very much in continuity with the idea of postmodernism, that particularly, all the postmodern theorists we talked about, Lyotard and Baudrillard in particular, talked about how we live in this society of language games and of images, and that's the level on which society will change. And so this is an idea that Anzaldúa has and that she enacts in her work in La Conciencia de la Mestiza. So this is a very sort of dense, theoretical, complex text, and I can't cover every point it makes here, but I want to pick out a few main ideas. So she begins with this idea of la raza cósmica. So she says, this is the very beginning of the essay, I think maybe after a quotation or something that introduces it. She says, José Vasconcelos, Mexican philosopher, envisaged una raza mestiza, una mezcla de razas afines, una raza de calor, la primera raza síntesis del globo. So one thing you'll note about her literary technique is she writes in both Spanish and English, and she doesn't translate the Spanish. She just assumes that if you're living on this continent, you need to speak both languages and you need to read both languages. And if you don't, you need to sort of catch up. And the Norton editors sort of accede to that idea by not footnoting the the words. But if you read the whole thing, it's clear what she's saying. But anyways, so she's quoting this Mexican philosopher, Jose Vasconcelos, who talked about a mixed race, a race of color, the first synthetic race in the world. And synthetic there means the race that puts the others together. A synthesis is when you bring things together into a greater whole. So the first race that kind of synthesizes the world. He called it a cosmic race, la raza cósmica, a fifth race embracing the four major races of the world. And I don't actually know what he had in mind. I haven't read Vasconcelos, so I don't know what the four major races of the world are. But this raza cósmica that emerges in the New World in North and South America, the idea is that in North and South America, you have indigenous people, you have European people, you have African people, and you have Asian people. I guess maybe those are the four races of the world according to this theory, but I don't know for sure. But the idea is that in North and South America, on these continents, you have all the races that live on all the other continents. And so there will emerge a new race, a cosmic, which means world, race in the New World. Opposite to the theory of the pure Aryan, which was really the Nazi theory of the pure Aryan Indo-European race, and to the policy of racial purity that white America practices, because the way that white society, or the way that the division of race works in the United States, was according to what was called the one-drop rule, which was that if you had any non-white ancestry, you weren't white. Or in particular, if you had any black ancestry, you were black. And so she's saying that this view of la raza cósmica is opposite to any theory of racial purity. His theory, Vasconcelos' theory, is one of inclusivity. At the confluence of two or more genetic streams with chromosomes constantly crossing over, this mixture of races, rather than resulting in an inferior being, provides hybrid progeny. And then he goes on, it is a consciousness of the borderlands. So this idea of the borderland as not just a physical place like the Rio Grande Valley of Texas, but a consciousness, a way of thinking. And this leads, she says, to a tolerance for ambiguity. So these numerous possibilities leave la mestiza, the mixed race woman, floundering in uncharted seas. In perceiving conflicting information and points of view, she is subjected to a swamping of her psychological borders. She has discovered that she can't hold concepts or ideas in rigid boundaries. The borders and walls that are supposed to keep the undesirable ideas out are entrenched habits and patterns of behavior. These habits and patterns are the enemy within. Rigidity means death. Only by remaining flexible is she able to stretch the psyche horizontally and vertically. La mestiza constantly has to shift out of habitual formations, from convergent thinking, analytical reasoning that tends to use rationality to move toward a single goal, a Western mode, to divergent thinking, characterized by a movement away from set patterns and goals toward a more whole perspective, one that includes rather than excludes. So I want to point a few things out here. Number one, note how similar this is to Reed's Neo-Hoodoo Manifesto. Both are articulating a rival vision to Western, monotheistic, dominant white culture. Both root that vision in their own identity. So for Reed, it's an African diasporic vision. It comes out of Africa. That's the main continent, we might say, for him. For Anzaldúa, she sees the New World of North and South America as the place where this will happen, and the raza cósmica, the European, African, Asian, indigenous person who is created in the New World, as the bearer of this consciousness. But both of them emphasize that what they're against really is, however you want to put it, white dominant culture, Christian dominant culture, European dominant culture, because they both see it as moving toward a single goal, as like one, there's one God, there's one form of rationality, there's one grand narrative. And they think that this is too rigid, too hierarchical, the source of the oppression of indigenous people or African people or Mexican people. And so this needs to be challenged by a more pluralistic and divergent point of view. And she doesn't only write about these ideas, but she puts them into practice in her writing by writing, in multiple languages, Mexican and English, Spanish and English most prominently, and in writing in multiple genres. So she incorporates poetry, she incorporates argumentative prose, manifesto-like prose, she incorporates at other points autobiography. So her own writing is ambiguous in genre and hybrid in nature. I just want to point out a few more things. She talks about not only, though, challenging, so I was just emphasizing how she talks about challenging Western, white, European dominant culture. But she wants to transcend to combat more than that. She talks about the oppressions that exist within all communities from her point of view as a queer woman. Because in her view, Western white culture oppresses other cultures, but pretty much all cultures oppress women and queer people. And so there needs to be this intersectional challenge to all forms of oppression wherever they occur. So she says, pero es difícil differentiating between lo heredado, lo adquirido, lo impuesto. So she says it's hard to tell what parts of your identity are inherited, are acquired, are imposed. It's hard to know where it comes from. She, the mestiza, puts history through a sieve, winnows out the lies, looks at the forces that we as a race, as women, have been part of. Luego voto lo que no vale, los desmientos, los desencuentros, el embrutecimiento. Aguardo el juicio bondo y enraizado de la gente antigua. This step is a conscious rupture with all oppressive traditions of all cultures and religions. She communicates that rupture, documents the struggle. She reinterprets history, and using new symbols, she shapes new myths. She adopts new perspectives toward the dark-skinned women and queers. She strengthens her tolerance and intolerance for ambiguity. She is willing to share, to make herself vulnerable to foreign ways of seeing and thinking. She surrenders all notions of safety, of the familiar, deconstruct, construct. She becomes a nahual, able to transform herself into a tree, a coyote, into another person. She learns to transform the small I into the total self. And I wanted to just read all of that so you could hear how it sounds, this sort of vision of a new person written in multiple languages, composed of multiple perspectives, but the idea that intersectionally and in terms of identity politics, you want to converge on the most oppressed. And in this view, the most oppressed are the dark-skinned, because there's a racial hierarchy that is white supremacist, and so it is against dark-skinned people. And then in many communities of color, there is also a hierarchy that is kind of inherited from the white supremacist society that stigmatizes the dark-skinned, and women and queers. So these figures that are the oppressed of all communities, the outcasts of all communities, it's this perspective you want to take. You can't just be, in Anzaldua's terms, you can't just be a feminist because it matters what race or class or sexuality a woman is. But you also can't be a kind of ethnic nationalist on behalf of an oppressed group, because there you'll just replicate the oppressive structures of masculine dominance and heterosexual dominance. So you have to take the view of the most oppressed. And then I want to also point out what her theory of racism and sexism and homophobia, particularly in this passage, she's talking about racism, but I think it works for all of the forms of oppression, what it is. She says the reason people oppress others is psychological. She's addressing in this passage, she's addressing, I think, white people, and she's sort of asking white people to acknowledge certain things. So I want you to acknowledge that you've split yourself from minority groups, that you disown us, that your dual consciousness splits off parts of yourself, transferring the negative parts onto us. Where there is persecution of minorities, there is shadow projection. Where there is violence and war, there is repression of shadow. To say that you are afraid of us, that to put distance between us you wear the mask of contempt. Admit that Mexico is your double, that she exists in the shadow of this country, that we are irrevocably tied to her. Gringo, accept the doppelganger in your psyche. So, and gringo is this term of slightly pejorative Mexican term for the North American. And she says, so she's addressing the North American, the white. But what is interesting to me is this psychological focus. It's not really for her primarily economic. It's not really even about power. That one group of people wants power over another or wants to economically exploit them, and so that's why they mistreat them, which might have been the old left view, the Marxist view. She says, no, this is psychology. And it's interesting that she uses this language of shadow projection. So that's a term she borrows from a thinker we've encountered once before in this course, Carl Jung, the Swiss psychoanalyst of the early 20th century. So she is willing to draw on certain European thinkers, but she draws on Jung, who is a psychologist and whose view of what causes hatred between people is really not political, but is psychological. And the idea here is that in Jung, I think I went through this when we talked about Streetcar Named Desire. For Jung, you have your conscious self, your persona, the thing you think you are and the face you present to the world. And in your unconscious is all this repressed stuff that you don't want to own up to. And for Anzaldúa, borrowing Jung's theory, racism is when people, and I think by extension, any form of oppression, men's of women, straight people's of gay people's, is when you take that part of yourself you don't want to admit is there, and you say, well, it's not part of me, it's out there, that person has it. So I'm not irrational, those people are irrational. I'm not sexually licentious. Those people are sexually licentious. And so you project the parts of yourself you don't want onto others. And that's what racism is. That's what sexism is. That's what homophobia is. She says at one point that gay men, she admires gay men because unlike straight men, they have sort of accepted the woman in themselves. And now, I don't actually know if we want to take on that definition of what it is to be gay, which is a little bit old-fashioned, a bit early 20th century. But nevertheless, just to understand her perspective, this idea that all people have all things in them. We all have these ambiguities and these complexities and these nuances psychologically. But if you don't want to own them and you project them outward, then you become the racist, the sexist, the homophobe. And so it's interesting to me that she focuses on psychology, that she focuses on language, as we'll see, and that the European thinker she's sort of willing to endorse in an essay in which she mainly says she wants to disown European thought is Jung. So that's interesting. And then I just want to end La Conciencia de la Mestiza, which, I mean, really the title says it all. It's about consciousness. And I want to look at this line. She says, nothing happens in the, quote, real, unquote, world unless it first happens in the images in our heads. So that could be the entire motto of postmodernism. First of all, we can't even say that the real world is real. We can't even use the word real without quotation marks because we live fundamentally inside of our minds, which are structured by language. And so nothing changes until our minds change, our consciousness changes, and our language changes. And so that's why what's important is the consciousness, this new consciousness of the mestiza as communicated in Anzaldúa through this new form of writing. And so that is Gloria Anzaldúa's Conciencia de la Mestiza. And I think that really crystallizes the ideas of multiculturalism that emerge in this late 20th century period. So in subsequent lectures, I will talk about Silko and Tan and Morrison's work. But this is Anzaldúa and multiculturalism as a period. Thank you and have a great day.